Before we start this week's podcast, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to our sponsor, Money Farm. Now, for those of you who don't know, Money Farm are one of the biggest digital wealth managers in the UK and Europe. They not only have a stocks and shares ISA, but they now have a pension which they can run for you. And now we've secured an exclusive deal for Money to the Masses podcast listeners and Money to the Masses readers, where Money Farm will reimburse the exit fees and dealing charges charged by your existing pension provider if you transfer to them. You can find out our view on Money Farm by going onto the moneytothemasses.com website and searching for Money Farm Pension Review, where you'll also find all the T's and C's. Now on with this week's show.
Hello and welcome to episode 198 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, how you doing, my friend?
I've got a slightly sore head this morning, Andy, I have to admit, but and you can probably hear in my voice that it was probably slightly a late one last night.
Yeah, and I think you owe it to the listeners to explain why you've got a bit of a sore head and a croaky voice. What happened last night?
Well, it was their fault, because anybody who listens to this podcast knows that we've been talking about doing a meet-up. And we did a meet-up, me and you, Andy, and Pete Matthew from Meaningful Money. And we basically went to a pub in the centre of the city of London and said to people, it's an open invite. We've been promoting it on social media, a podcast, newsletter, on the website, and just said, come along. And that's what exactly happened, didn't it, Andy?
It did. And before the meetup, I said to you, off pod, I said to you, because I'm naturally pessimistic, and I know we have got lots of listeners, and I know that potentially people would have liked to have come, but because I'm a pessimist, I said to you tentatively, I reckon single numbers, perhaps even as low as 4, just because I'm an eternal pessimist. And, well, how many turned up, Damien? It was crazy.
I don't know. I kind of lost count because the pub was busy. It was packed. But, I mean, on and off throughout the night, it must have been, what would you say, about 50 people came to the whole thing?
Yeah, I would tentatively guess it was somewhere between 40 to 50 over the course of the evening, and it was just awesome. It was so good.
Yeah, so I want to say thank you to everybody who made the effort, and there were some people who came from quite some distances. I think the longest one was somebody travelled all the way up from Maidstone. Specifically, they didn't even work in London, so I'm eternally grateful.
Damien, I can beat that. There was a lovely gentleman in the name of Bob, and also Vlad, who travelled down from Manchester, and they don't live in the area, and they purposely came down.
Whoa! I didn't know that. I didn't know that one. I didn't know that's where they were from. I mean, this week's podcast isn't going to be that long. So if you're looking at the sort of timings of the podcast, you're thinking that's quite a short one. It's because we wanted to have a quick show to thank everybody for coming. It is a Saturday that we're doing this because the meetup was on a Friday. But for those of you who didn't come, it was amazing because we had so many people come along and we were chatting to them all and they were talking to each other and making friends, and it was a really good atmosphere. So they've all said they want to do it again. So we will try in the future to do another event because there was everybody got a lot out of it, so including us. Because what was fantastic about it is I was able to stand there and we could talk to you guys who listen to this podcast and find out what you like, what you want to have topics on, and just stories of people who saying, oh, I listened to I always remember one podcast where you said this and I did it had this impact on me. And that's amazing because you have to remember we do these podcasts and the stuff goes out there and we don't necessarily get any direct feedback from it. I mean, one of my favourites was a chap who had negotiated with Hargreaves Lansdown on the size of the fee he pays, which is normally about 0.4, 0.45%. He negotiated it down to 0.25% a year. It doesn't sound a lot, but it actually works out to be a couple of thousand a year that he saves, but that would be every year. So that was a fantastic story to hear that he'd done that after listening to the podcast. So there you go. If you are with Hargreaves and have a sizable amount of money with them, you can do the same. So all that feedback, there were people coming up with stories of how one guy paid down £100,000 worth of debt, which was incredible.
I had another story from a lady who had actually read your book and as a result had checked her tax codes and had made several thousand, I think it was £7,000 worth of savings on tax, specifically again through the content that you send out there, and as a result she listened to the podcast and loves it. So all of these stories were fantastic to hear last night.
So if you have any questions and things you want to send in, I've told a number of you who came last night to email things in because I wanted to continue the conversation. But do read the book and look at the website. And we are going to do something like this again because it was very, very popular. So, and I just want to say to all those people who came, do please drop me a line via email or social media or whatever, because I'd like to keep in touch, because if we do something similar again, it'd be great if you guys could all come along. And one of the things that I had a real positive about the night was that it wasn't all male dominated. It wasn't all men. There was quite a number of women as well, which is brilliant, because the problem with the world of finance is too male dominated, isn't it, Andy? And so it was great to see there were people who wanted to listen to money that were both men, women, young, old. The age range was great.
It was absolutely fantastic. There were people from all different backgrounds and from all ages and from all over the country, and other countries too. I mean, we had Italy and Ukraine represented among others, I'm sure. But yeah, it was amazing.
Yes, and another thing that was quite funny, everybody seemed to be called Andy who came, didn't they? Yeah. It just seemed to have about 6-7 Andys in the room. But another Damien came, which was amazing. And one of the others, a chap called Simon, who doesn't actually listen to the podcast himself, but one of his daughters does, and they're twins as well. So you can see them on the on our social media feed. So if you want to get a feel for what the evening was like, go onto Instagram and other social media channels. I shared quite a lot of pictures, and yeah, just thank you for everybody who came, because we get a lot back, and I'm absolutely buzzing after doing that. It just it reinvigorates you to really push forward what we're doing in Money to the Masses and to get that positive feedback. So moving on, I do want to cover some money stuff this week on the podcast, Andy. It's not just talking about us going and the listeners all going out and getting drunk. But so what I'm going to do is, it was the budget week this week. So it probably actually passed quite a few people by in a way, because it was slightly uneventful. So I'm going to go straight into it and just give a bit of a roundup of what actually happened in the budget. And then just one or two things that were hidden that people might want to sort of pay a bit of attention to. I mean, this is quite funny, because last night people were asking me, how do you decide what you're going to do on the podcast? And then I came up with this idea while I was talking to them. And I said, this is kind of how it generally works. So true to my word. Budget.
And just a little bit of a glimpse behind the curtain. Often Damien will tell me that we may need to delay the podcast for 10 minutes because he needs one more bit for the podcast. So often the last piece is a very last minute deal, but that's good. That means that you can create up to the minute content.
Thinking on your feet, Andy. That's what it is. Yeah. I like to sort of live life on the edge. So the budget, it was quite a non-event, because Philip Hammond said that all of his rabbits had been pulled out of the hat previously by other politicians in his party, so he didn't have anything sort of exciting that was going to blow the doors off. But for personal finance journalists, they were obviously a little bit scratching around for anything exciting. But what I want to do is just tell you some of the key things that were in there. So from the economy perspective, is that growth forecasts were nudged up. So from 1.3%, that doesn't sound a lot, to 1.6% in 2019. The real point is that they think the economy might improve. I don't know how they know this, given where Brexit could go. And they're planning on creating lots more jobs. One thing I will add, that it almost felt slightly pointless doing this budget, because Brexit is going to have such an impact with a deal we have or we don't, that we either are going to have another budget to draw things up, or we're going to have a new Chancellor and more than likely a new government, or certainly Prime Minister. So all of this is going to be up in the air. So anything they've announced, it's very unlikely, I think, personally, that much of it will end up going into law. So aside from the fact that they were telling us the economy was going to pick up, I don't know quite how much I believe on that regard. Personal taxation, which is what people are probably interested in, you normally have an allowance of 11,850. That's going to go up to 12,500. The one thing was meant to be this is exciting, this is the headline, was that they were nudging up the higher rate income tax threshold. So the point when you go from 20% to 40%, that number is at the moment 46,350. So what they want going to do from April is that's going to be £50,000. So you'll pay, after you've had your personal income tax allowance, you're going to pay 20% income tax on that amount all the way up to £50,000. So that was the big wow, we're helping Middle England. I'll come back to that, because there's something in the detail that they didn't quite tell you, which makes it less exciting. Those things will go up with inflation, those limits. In terms of beer and cider, duties were frozen. On wine, it's going to go up slightly by 8p. That's in February next year. I mean, it's neither here nor there. Obviously, tobacco duty always goes up, so it's going up in line with inflation, plus 2%. Fuel duty will be frozen for the 9th year in a row, apparently. And in terms of housing, they've announced that first-time buyers purchasing shared equity homes will have an exemption from stamp duty up to £500,000 in terms of the value of the house. So it wasn't anything to get too excited about. There were some tweaks to the NHS in there as well, and funding going to things like air ambulances and funding going to fix potholes, all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't anything to get too excited. But what I wanted to quickly point out was some of the detail that was overlooked, because the bit that got me intrigued is this nudge up of the threshold to £50,000. What they didn't highlight, and came out slightly after if you look at the detail, is that the threshold for national insurance contributions, so the upper earning level, that's the level at which you go from paying 2% national insurance contributions on that portion of your money to 12%. That level is moving up in line with the £50,000 new limit on income tax at 40%. What that basically means is that if you benefit from the increase in the threshold on income tax, at the same time you're going to have to pay more national insurance. So if you imagine that from that 46,000 area, which we are now, where the limit is now, to 50,000, you might be sitting there thinking, oh, I don't have to pay 40% tax on that anymore, it's going to be 20. Well, the reality is that you're also going to pay an extra 10% national insurance on that portion. So you're really only going to get a 10% tax saving, which, I mean, that's still good, but it's not what the headlines were shouting about. So there's a bit of a devil in the detail there. The other thing I just wanted to point out is that what it means is that the 50,000 level is becoming really crucial, because at the moment, if you earn over that, you start to lose your child benefit. You have to pay it back at the end of the year via your self-assessment. So what's going to happen is when you get to £50,000 now, you're going to go from paying 20% tax, but you're going to nudge up into the 40% tax bracket, but at the same time start being penalised on child benefit. And the effective tax rate that means is you start going from a 20% tax rate on that money above 50,000 to effectively a 60% tax rate. So the people who are being caught by this child benefit clawback are going to feel like they're being hammered even more, if that makes sense. So that again is something that is in the detail. It's just the effective rate. It's just what's going to happen as a result of these changes. I just want to point out some other two other pieces of detail that weren't really highlighted in terms of property. Now, when you sell your house, you normally, if it's your home, then you don't pay tax on it. There's an exemption. But of course, if there's a period of time where you rent your house out before you sell it, then you would normally pay tax on that portion, but you can get a relief on that. So it's a lettings relief. They're talking about, proposing anyway, of ditching that, which could mean that would cost some people who would have benefited in the future about 11 to 12 grand's worth of capital gains tax. The other one that they're talking about is that when you sell a house, so if, for example, I decided to rent my house out for a period of time, and let's say a year, and I moved into a new house, I then sold my old home, I would still get the full exemption for the whole period, because the last 18 months of ownership of your property is always assumed that you live there, even if you didn't. And the reason that rule exists is to try and help people be mobile and move around the country and when they're seeking for jobs. So that's the idea of that rule. So it didn't penalise people who had to move quickly for a job. Now that's 18 months at the moment. They're talking about halving that to 9 months. It's a proposal, but it's worth bearing in mind, because if you're like me, who may be thinking at some point of moving to schools or whatever it is, then you might have to factor in that in the next sort of couple of years they could tamper with that relief. On pensions, again, like I sort of said last week in the podcast, they didn't do anything. Everyone panics and they're going to change pension tax relief on contributions, and that didn't happen. So again, it was just one that's you're going to have that in the next budget, probably around Brexit. When we have one, they're going to talk about it again, because they're going to try and raid pensions and make them give you less of an incentive. So there you go, Andy, quick roundup on the budget. Before we finish this week, I just wanted to quickly say something on investing. Now, a bit of homework really, because I'm off next week going to a conference in Portugal, funnily enough, to do with tech. and the future of tech and sort of money and everything like that. So I might have some insights from that when I come back next week. All sorts of AI, robotics and all that kind of stuff. But while I'm away, just a bit of homework. Have a look at the stock market because it's going to be interesting. We've got the midterms in America, the midterm elections, and that could cause a bit of an upset. Now, as October was a dire month for the stock market, it bounced right at the end, the last 2 days of October and into the beginning of November. So suddenly all the bulls jumped on that and said the market is going to shoot higher. A word of caution is that, funnily enough, there's a seasonal factor that the last 2 days of October are the best two-day ends, if that makes sense, the best endings of a month in any month in a year. So the last 2 days in October are better than the last 2 days in September and the last 2 in August, etc. And they tend to always be positive. So it may just be a bit of seasonality rather than the market recovering. But we had a little bit of an uptick, not replacing any of the losses from October, but it got some people excited. But we got the midterms next week, and depending on what happens, that could cause a market wobble. If you get your stock market app out, you look at it, go and click on the S&P. Key levels to look at, 2,700 is an important level on the S&P 500, because that is the level at which, if we go below that again, then we're probably going to have another little turn southwards and the market could unravel a little bit further. And then below that, 2,600 is key. If we want to get bullish, we've got to break above 2,800 if the uptrend is going to continue. So keep an eye on those numbers in the next week, especially around the midterms, because what happens in America, I think those levels are becoming more and more important. And the other one is, I'll just quickly say, keep an eye on the DAX. I think I talked about it before. The German DAX, they're correlated. There's a high correlation between the German stock market and the US stock market. So if the German DAX keeps falling, it may be a bad omen. Well, it is a bad omen for the US stock market. And I think that's it, Andy, for this week. Although I did see one other tip I want to chuck out there. I did say I'd keep it short. I'm trying. Is that I saw a bit of research this week of talking about retiring and not paying enough money into your pension. And actually, the research showed the most effective way to boost your retirement income is to delay your retirement. That seems kind of obvious, but they put some numbers to it. And
yeah, that's like saying the easiest way to save money is not to spend it.
And I did almost make a flippant comment about it on Twitter to say, basically, if you follow this to the nth degree, what you're saying is work till the day you die. And then you won't need any retirement savings. But there's quite a nice quirk of compounding that starts to happen. So if you delay your retirement by 1 year, it's with all sorts of assumptions they used, it boosts your retirement income by 6.7%. Okay, that's not amazing. But you delay your retirement by 3 years, that number goes up to 23%. If you delay by 5 years, it's over 40% boost to your retirement income. So there's a compounding effect. It's basically also because you've got a greater chance of dying before you get all your money. Yeah. So anyway, I thought I'd throw it out there. It's something that don't panic. If you haven't saved enough money, you're just going to have to work a little bit longer like the rest of us.
Excellent stuff. Thank you, Damien. I really enjoyed it again this week. It was obviously a shorter one because we're doing this on a Saturday just after the meetup, but we'll be back again soon. Did you say we're not going to be doing one next week?
Andy, do listen. Do keep up. No, I am going to be doing one next week. It will probably... Actually, Andy, I have to say I'm going to try my hardest because I'm going to be back quite late into next week at the end. So if I can...
That was kind of what I was alluding to.
Yeah, sorry, Andy. I'm telling myself...
we could have our first fight on air.
I'm going to try my hardest to do a podcast with you next week. Apologies. Right, we're done.
Good stuff. All the usual stuff. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so at Money to the Masses is Twitter. Obviously, get onto Damien's website. There's all the details there. Get on Instagram. Send Damien an email, damien@moneytothemasses.com. It's been lovely chatting with you guys that came up yesterday. We'll be doing it again soon. Do review the podcast and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.